This tutorial is about how to create one-point perspective or the illusion of three-dimensional space using Photopea. So you start out by creating a new file for print, letter size, and then you're going to do image, transform, and rotate it 90 degrees so it is landscape. Create a new layer. And in that layer, you're going to use your brush tool to create a one-point perspective grid. What I'm doing is I'm pulling from the top the ruler down to create a guideline, and I'm going to change my foreground color to black. And then I'm going to use the brush tool, and if you hold the shift key down, you can click at the beginning of a line. And by holding the shift key down, you click at the end of the line, it will create a straight line. So then I'm going to create a vanishing point in the middle of my straight line. And I am going to then, I'm adjusting the brush size so I can actually see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to create straight lines from the vanishing point, fanning out across the page. I'm not really measuring. So I just created a bunch of lines without really worrying about it. But they have to start at the vanishing point and end off the edge of the page. That is very important. So you just click in the first spot, click in the second spot while holding down the shift key, and you will connect the lines. Now I'm going to create some horizontal lines. So I use my guide, my grid guide. This doesn't show up in the final JPEG, but I just drag down a line from the top, and you're making lines that are parallel to the to the horizon line. So you don't want them to be crooked, so you drag down a guideline and you use that. And you're starting to see a checkerboard that starts at the horizon line and goes down, and that all the rectangles get bigger as they get closer to the bottom of the page. So the bottom of the page is the foreground, and up a little higher is the middle ground, and the background is at the horizon line. So I'm changing the opacity now and adding a new layer. So I kind of grayed out the grid, and now I'm just drawing some rectangles using my shape tool. I'm just changing the color a little bit, making it darker, adding a second rectangle, and then I'm going to do Edit, Transform, Perspective. And you can see that I can warp it so that it looks like it's going away in space. But I don't really want to do that. I want to make it so that it looks like it's going away towards the vanishing point. I want it to follow the grid. That's why I created the grid. So I'm just going to move the boxes around a little bit and adjust until it looks like the top and bottom edge of that side of my rectangular solid are both going to follow along to the vanishing point. Okay? All the lines that are going away from you have to end at the vanishing point. They cannot end anywhere else. So I have to actually edit the scale, edit, transform, scale to make sure that my lines are actually heading towards the vanishing point. Now I'm doing edit, transform, perspective, and you can see it isn't quite working out exactly the way I want because it really needs to go to that vanishing point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I can do edit, transform, distort, and I can pull the lines up and down to make them actually go towards the vanishing point. So perspective is one technique, and distort is another. If you use distort, you can just pull one angle without pulling the other. If you use, which is what I'm doing now, if you use edit, transform, perspective, both the top and bottom will distort. So the idea is you must make it so that the top line, if you were to extend it, would end up at the vanishing point, and the bottom line, if you were to extend it, would continue towards that vanishing point. So the grid can help you to guide you. And you have to just really keep that vanishing point in mind. So I'm going to keep switching colors. I'm going to add more buildings. Now I'm taking that yellow building and I dragged that layer up to the top because it is in front of and therefore overlapping the other buildings. So if you know that the bottom is the foreground, that means that whatever you draw in the foreground has to overlap whatever is higher on the page. So that means that the you must make those shapes on higher up layers. So the layers, everything in the top layer is in the foreground, everything in the middle layers is in the middle ground, everything in the bottom layers is in the background. So if you have to kind of make sure that the layers in your Photopea or Photoshop file correspond with the layering of space in your picture logically, or else the wrong things will overlap and you'll destroy that sense of three-dimensional space. Now, every once in a while, I actually just hide the grid layer to see what it would look like without the grid, to see if I maintain that sense of three-dimensional space. So again, I might want to do a little bit of tweaking. I'm just moving things around a little to make it look a little bit better. I might want to distort the size a little bit. Edit, transform, scale will distort the size, or you could just use free transform. That will work as well. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to select multiple layers. I'm going to select all the layers with all the boxes. And the way you select more than one layer is you hold the Shift key down. So I'm actually going to select all those layers together. You can see them all being highlighted together. And then I'm going to do layer, duplicate layer, and it'll duplicate all those shapes. And now I'm actually going to transform the scale of the shapes that are in the front. That means I'm going to go to the top shapes and I'm making them bigger. I'm actually making them so big that they go off the edge of the page. And that's going to give a sense of very deep space. So you may need to zoom out to do this. But you see how now I've got this really extended sense of depth because I've got stuff in the extreme foreground and then in the middle ground and then in the background, and I didn't have to draw the boxes again to get that effect. I just had to duplicate the boxes I've already drawn, go to the ones that were actually in the layer menu on the top, and just select all those. You can select multiple layers by holding the Shift key down and then doing Edit Transform, Free Transform, or Edit Transform Scale. When it looks right, you just hit the check. And now you've got this really strong sense of very deep space. Look how many layers I have looking at the layer menu on the right. All right, now I'm going to play around with the canvas size, make the canvas size bigger. So I doubled the canvas size so you can now see more of the deep space, all the stuff that went off the edge of the page. So I'm just going to go down to the background, fill it with white so that I don't have that distraction. And now I'm really looking at the different shapes up close. And I've got a very deep sense of foreground, extreme foreground, foreground, middle ground, background. The horizon, as you know, is where the earth meets the sky. So the highest object that sits on the ground, in order for it to look like it's on the ground, the bottom of it has to be at or below the horizon line. If it's any higher than the horizon line, the bottom of the object is any higher than the horizon line, it's going to be floating. It won't make sense because the horizon line is where the earth meets the sky. Just think about going to the water and to the ocean and looking at the horizon. Anything higher than the horizon line is sky. Anything from the horizon line down is water. Same thing, same concept. So if you need to trim any of the buildings, and you actually do need to use your eraser, all you have to do is rasterize them. That means you go to the layer, you right-click, and you rasterize them, and it'll turn it from a vector-based object to a pixel-based object. An eraser does not work on a vector object like a shape, but you can transform the shape to a pixel-based object. You can just use the eraser. So I'm actually rasterizing some layers so I can trim. When you erase, if you want to erase in a straight line, if you click the first spot that you want to erase at, and then you hold the shift key down and hold the second spot, you can erase in a straight line just by holding the shift key down. The same way you can draw in a straight line, you can erase in a straight line. Okay, so at this point, I'm just basically tweaking the shapes. I want to put a window into one of the buildings, and I'll do that later. But if you put windows in and they're on the front of the building, they're just going to be rectangular or square. If they're on the part of the building that's going towards the horizon line, the side of the building, then the top of the window and the bottom of the window have to follow the same perspective rules. They have to angle towards the vanishing point, which means that if you were to extend the line all the way, it would eventually get to the vanishing point. So I've decided I want some characters in my city. And fortunately, earlier in the year, we did do some character design. So I'm going to pick a character that was designed by one of my students. And I'll show you how you would put characters in your city. So let me go to my files and find an interesting character. And, oh, I love this one. This one's really cute. I think Bruni made this one. She likes making pink characters. Okay, so let me click on this. And let me do select all, edit copy. And I will paste my character into my city. And now this is where it gets a little tricky. His eyes need to line up with the horizon line. I don't care how big or little he is. His eyes need to line up with the horizon line, and his feet need to be on the ground wherever he is. Okay? So let me show you how that practice works in real life. If he's far away, his eyes are on the horizon line and his feet are on the ground. Now I'm going to duplicate the layer, and I'm going to edit it for scale. Edit, transform, scale. And I'm going to make the guy in the front, that means the guy that's on the topmost layer in the layer menu, bigger because he's nearer to me. But I line up his eyes with the horizon line and then make him bigger after I've done that. And there's a reason why this is always going to be so. Another name for the horizon line is the camera line, okay? If you're holding a camera and you're photographing this scene, your camera perceives the horizon line as being at your actual eye level. So if you were to get on top of a ladder or climb to the top of the Eiffel Tower or climb to the top of a high building, your horizon line would be in a different place. It would be higher up and you would see more land underneath you. Whereas if you're on your stomach with your camera and you're looking, your horizon line would be lower down and you'd be able to see more sky and less stuff underneath you because there would be less stuff underneath you. So wherever you are, your horizon line lines up with your eye. And you'll always see that to be the case. In other words, if you went down to the waterfront and you looked out at the water, the horizon line would be even with your eyes. If you then went to the top of a very tall building and looked out at the waterfront, the horizon line would still be even with your eyes. No matter where you are, the horizon line is even with your eyes. So keeping that in mind, the characters that you're looking at, if the horizon line is eye level, then you make the horizon line eye level. So you put all the characters so that their eyes are at the horizon line, but then you have to enlarge them if they're in the foreground so their feet still touch the ground. Otherwise, they're going to look like they're floating. It's not going to make any sense. So if you look at all these characters, all their eyes do line up. And that's a thing that a lot of people don't realize. The other thing you're going to have to keep in mind is a sense of scale. So if a person's in the extreme, I'm adding a nice gradient to the sky just for fun. But the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is you have to make sure the buildings and the windows and the doors are the right size. You wouldn't have a person in the extreme foreground who's huge and have him next to a tiny little building where the door is lower than his head. So make sure that the characters are the correct size to fit inside doorways or to look through windows. Otherwise, the scale will be off and your entire world, the imaginary world you created, won't make any sense. So you got to make sure that your people are always the correct size relative to the buildings and to the doorways and to the windows. You just have to think about it. Like you're an adult human, the doorway is going to be, even a tall person should be able to get through a doorway without smacking their head. So, the doorway is going to be maybe 8 feet. An adult male might be 6 feet. An adult female might be, 5'4". You got to make sure your windows are in line with that. Also, make sure that the front and back part of the window, the sides going up and down, the vertical lines are actually vertical. Don't let them be at some weird angle. And make sure they're straight up and down and parallel to the front and back vertical lines of the building too. Okay, so you see how that window, the top line, if extended, will go towards the vanishing point, and the bottom line, if extended, will go to the vanishing point, and the front and back are vertical. Now, I'm going to actually make it look like this person is looking through the window by erasing in a straight line everything that's below the window, and then I'm going to mess around with the opacity. If I make the person look a little bit transparent, it'll look like he's on the other side of the glass, even though he's not. So he's actually, technically, that layer is in front of the window, but I'm going to make it look like it's in back of the window. So those are my tips and tricks for creating a one-point perspective drawing. I will say, and I'm going to just kind of mess around with it a little bit, I will say that it takes a little bit of thinking to do it properly. To create a world that makes sense. You might have to think about it a little bit to place the eyes in the right place, to make the sizes correct. To make the overlapping work, you might have to rearrange layers. I'm just messing around with layer styles right now to see if I can change the look of something. I ended up not using that technique in this particular tutorial. So it just, if you go to the layer menu and you go layer styles, there's all sorts of things like with gradients and drop shadows and stuff. Those are fun to play around with, which is what I'm doing now. I ended up ultimately not using them in this particular tutorial. However, just knowing they're there, they might come in handy for you later. Like, for instance, one of the things that you can create is a drop shadow, and that could be kind of fun. So when you're done, you're going to export it either as a JPEG or a PNG. And then I'm going to just show you how to just do a quick 3D design where you don't actually make the grid and you don't draw the vanishing point, but you kind of keep in mind where you think they're going to be. So this is sort of a technical, I'm doing this for the first time, I'm not really sure how to do it. Let me make the grid, let me follow the grid assignment. But I'm going to show you another picture I created recently where I didn't draw the vanishing point or make a grid, and that can be sometimes just as satisfying, and the look can be just as three-dimensional. So let me show you that right now. It's also using the shape tool. I also created a letter size for print document, and I turned it horizontal. So right now I'm going to show you that. Let me just save my file here. So first I save it as a Photoshop document with all the layers, and then I export it as a JPEG. So I had a lot of fun doing this, and now I'm going to show you this one. This one was done without making the grid first. I just sort of imagined where the horizon line would be. So File, New, create letter size. I then transformed it by rotating it 90 degrees to make it horizontal. If I'm drawing a landscape, I have to hold my paper landscape. So I ended up using the brush tool. Actually, I ended up using the shape tool. I played around with the color. And there's no horizon line, there's no vanishing point now. There's just me doing edit, transform, perspective. Making a little box. Just for fun. And then I'm going to create a horizon line by just creating the ground. And notice how I went lower and created the ground underneath my shape. So now I'm going to make a circle. And that circle is like a little portal or window. So let me change the color. I'll change it to white. So now it looks like I can look through the wall, but really it's just actually a circle on top of the wall. And now I'm adding a drop shadow by doing layer styles. And a drop shadow is one of the choices. So it kind of gives it a 3D look. It looks like I'm looking through a hole instead of what really is happening is there's a circle on top of the rectangle, but it looks like I'm looking through a hole. And now I clicked multiple layers and I did layer, duplicate layer, and I'm now edit, transform, scale, or edit, transform, free transform. I'm making another layer on top. Now, what comes in handy is the knowledge that I can't erase a vector-based object, but I can always rasterize it, turning it into a pixel-based object, and then I can erase. So I'm now duplicating more layers. I'm going to the layers that are on the bottom. Notice how I have to scroll down on my layer menu and pick those layers. And then I hold the shift key down to select multiple layers. And I can duplicate them. I can do edit, transform, scale, or edit, transform, free transform. And again, I never drew a vanishing point. But what I did do is I imagined a vanishing point, okay? So nothing is allowed to float. Anything where the bottom of the object is at or below the horizon line is fine. If the bottom of the object is above the horizon line, that means it is not on the ground, it's in the sky. So notice how I edit, transformed, and then raised my horizon line. But that comes, there's a problem in that I now have these circles that don't look like windows anymore. So I had to rasterize them. I had used the shift key and click one end and click the other end with the eraser and erase the bottom part of it. So as I was working, I sort of developed a technique. Initially, I erased, but then I realized I actually need that bottom half. So I selected it with the magic wand. I selected the top part with the magic wand, and I duplicated it, and then I actually flipped it. I had to play around with this a little bit. So what I ultimately realized is that I don't want to get rid of the bottom half. I just want to change its color. Okay, so I did edit, flip vertically, and then I had to change its color. So I used the magic wand, I selected the white part, and I changed the color. To the foreground color, which is that dark blue. And then I just used the move tool and I moved it up. So now that I kind of got the hang of this, when I did the second one, I didn't actually want to get rid of that bottom half of the circle. So what I did was I rasterized the white circle, which has the drop shadow. And now that it's rasterized, I erase a little line going from one end to the other. Yep. And then I select with the magic wand the bottom half, and I change the color to the foreground color, which is the same as my horizon and my land. Okay, so I just click on one side. First I have to rasterize it. Okay, click on one side. Hold the shift key, click on the other side. Make sure you're in the right layer. Click on one side. Hold the shift key, click on the other side, go to the magic wand, click the bottom part, and change the fill color. And then just move it up. And now it looks as if I'm looking through a window and I can see the blue water or the blue land through the window. But really, that's not what's actually happening. What's actually happening is it's a circle on top of the window with different colors. But who's to know? So now I can keep playing around. But you see how it doesn't really follow an exact perspective. Like some of the lines are a little off. If I were to take all those lines and extend them, they wouldn't all go to the vanishing point. So the vanishing point is, okay, now I'm just playing around with drop shadows and layer styles to see if anything looks good. I think I ultimately ended up not using the drop shadows anywhere except the windows. They look good on the windows, but they didn't end up looking good anywhere else. So I'm just experimenting. But one of the things is this does not follow exact perspective lines. So I basically imagined a horizon line. I imagined a vanishing point. And I just played around with making my picture, quote unquote, look 3D. But I didn't follow the exact rules of perspective. And depending on what sort of effect you're going for, that's actually fine. If you look at my extreme foreground and you look at how steep that angle is on the side of the building, that line is not going to extend to the vanishing point. So technically it is wrong. I think if I had to go back, I would fix it. But when I look at this image, it's this very pleasing image. And frankly, I didn't even notice that one line was totally wrong. So sometimes you just want to play around with making stuff look 3D and without following the exact rules of perspective. And depending on what context you're working in, that might be fine. If you're making an architectural rendering, obviously you have to follow the rules of perspective. If you're making an illustration, it might look better if you follow the rules of perspective, or it might not. It might be fine. There are a lot of famous pieces of artwork that do follow the exact rules of perspective, but there are actually plenty of famous pieces of artwork that don't follow them. So it's something you need to be aware of because it can make your artwork better. But rules are meant to be broken, and once you have done the exercise with the grid and you kind of know what perspective is and how to do it, you're free to use it or not use it as the situation dictates. So now I'm just playing around with gradients in the background, messing around with the sky, trying to get my picture to look a certain way. And again, this is all just for fun. I'm just trying to, get a fun look that I like. So I'm messing around with layer styles. I'm messing around with gradients and doing 2 different gradients. I messed around with deleting the white part of the background so that the sunrise could show through. I just, there was a lot of playing around. And I think that's one of the things that makes art so enjoyable is the playing around with something and just coming up with a new look that you didn't necessarily expect to find, but that you like. I think that if you get too hung up on the rules and you stop worrying about what your art looks like or whether it's pleasing to you, I think that it starts to become more work and less play, and the act of creating art loses its enjoyment. So you have to be very careful that when you learn a new technique, you don't get so totally hung up on doing it right, but you more get into creating art for the joy of creating it and creating something that looks cool, that you are happy with. And if you're working for a client, because you're being paid, you may also want to make sure that you're happy with the artwork and that your client is also happy. So sometimes working for an audience can be a growthful experience for an artist. Anyway, that's my finished project. I hope you enjoyed my tutorial.